When was the last time you felt in control of your business finances? Expenses tracked, invoices sent, taxes ready. That's where Found comes in. Found brings your banking, bookkeeping, invoicing, and taxes together in one simple app. Manage expenses, invoice clients, send payments, and prep for tax time right where you bank. Join the hundreds of thousands who have already streamlined their finances with Found. Open a Found account for free at found.com. That's FOUND.com. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Lead Bank, member FDIC.
Fáilte Rash a Cárja to Undercover Irish, and on today's episode, familiar theme, place names. But today, we're going to look at the darker side. Because as we've discussed previously on episodes here on Undercover Irish, hidden inside most Irish place names is a depth, something really deep, a real meaning. Sometimes we have to look at it through the lens of language to understand it. We have to look at the Gaeilge meaning, the meaning in Irish. Ireland is full of place names connected with the darker side of life and death. Executions, slaughter, the devil himself, monsters, famine on Geata, and mass graves. Entire landscapes carrying memories most people pass every day without even realising. And the fascinating thing is, a lot of these names are incredibly old. Older than British rule, older than the occupation of Ireland, older than the plantations, some of them possibly older than Christianity itself, which means the Irish landscape has been storing memory for centuries, maybe millennia. Place names in Ireland don't just describe geography. They describe experience, what happened there, what people feared there, what people witnessed there. Sometimes they preserve folklore. Sometimes they preserve trauma. And sometimes it's hard to tell where one ends and the other one begins. As I said, you see it especially as Gaeilge in the Irish language, because when you translate some of the names literally, they become shockingly dark. Places like Béal Átha na Marav, the ford of the dead, or Powl an Bháis, the hole of death, or Cnoc na Croiche, the hill of the Gallows. And they aren't fantasy names, these are real places. Places people still live beside today, drive through them, and grow up around them. And the interesting thing is, the landscape often remembers things official history doesn't, especially here in Ireland. Because Irish history wasn't always preserved through institutions. A lot of it survived through oral tradition, ó bhéal go bhéal, from mouth to mouth, ó gluain go gluain, from generation to generation. Folklore, local memory, and of course place names. Particularly the history of ordinary people, not kings or governments or empires, but communities. This matters in a country that was so heavily shaped by colonisation, because throughout Irish history, control over the landscape also meant control over memory. English maps renamed places, anglicised them. Irish names disappeared, at least from official records. Some meanings survived, and others became distorted. But despite all of that, the older layers are still there underneath, still haunting the map. So this is what this episode is about. Not just creepy names or ghost stories, although we will feature those, but an exploration of how Ireland remembers, how violence becomes geography, how mythology becomes landscape, and how fear becomes language, and how the Irish landscape quietly carries, and sometimes overtly, centuries of memory hidden in plain sight. A Cárja is Éolan, and you're with Undercover Irish. This is the podcast where we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. So wherever you are a Cárja around the globe, be it at home or part of the great Irish diaspora abroad, sit back and enjoy this episode of Undercover Irish, where we look at Ireland's darkest place names. Accordia, my friends, let's start with some of the darkest place names, the ones that revolve around the devil. But the interesting thing about this is most of them probably had nothing to do with the devil originally, because that part usually comes later. Christianity only came to Ireland around the 5th century. Because when Christianity spread throughout Ireland, older sacred places didn't disappear overnight, obviously, but they often changed meaning, particularly as time passed. Places people already associated with danger or mystery or the supernatural gradually became linked with evil instead. And you can see it there in the landscape. So take, for example, the Devil's Bit in Cúnta Tubredorn in County Tipperary. Oscailga in Irish, it's called Bearnán Éile. Now, Bearnán means a little gap, and Éile refers to an ancient kingdom and people who once lived across parts of Tipperary and Offaly. The Éile were an Irish Tua, an early Irish Tua, a small kingdom, long before modern counties existed. So the original Irish name has nothing dark in it at all. It just means the little gap of Éile, a geographical description, and that's it. But then later folklore reshapes the mountain completely. The story says the devil took a huge bite out of the mountain while fleeing St. Patrick and spat the missing piece southward, creating the rock of Cashel, which we've mentioned on earlier podcasts. And suddenly, the landscape becomes part of a Christian moral story. You see versions of this all over Ireland, repeated again and again. Places that once may have been seen as sacred or just simply dangerous, they become associated with the devil instead. And when you think about Ireland and Irish people living here for most of history, that makes complete sense. A mountain pass could kill you. A forest at night was genuinely a frightening thing. Caves would feel like entrances to another world and were often described as such. Long before horror films or ghost stories, the landscape already carried fear. And that's what makes places like Devil's Glen in Wicklow so interesting. Even today, it feels isolated. Dense woods and deep ravines, the kind of place where mist hangs on the trees at certain points of the year. And once Christianity arrives, those older fears get translated into a new language, if you'll pardon the pun. The dangerous wilderness becomes kind of morally dangerous too. Ireland is full of names like this. The Devil's Ladder in Kerry. Anyone who's ever scaled Carron-Toole will know that spot, that place. The Devil's Chimney in Sligo. The Devil's Punch Bowl near Killarney, Killarna. Again and again and again, we see this. Wild landscapes become supernatural landscapes. But Christianity wasn't creating fear from nothing. Ireland already had its own terrifying mythology long before that. And some of the older Irish place names still preserve it. And one of the best examples of this is Powl na Béist, usually translated today as the hole of the worm. But Péist in older Irish doesn't mean a little worm. It means something darker. A serpent, a monster, a dragon-like figure. So Powl na Béist is really closer to the hole of the monster. In a similar vein, you have Uibh na Gut, or Uibh na Gat in Roscommon, the Cave of the Cats, which is probably one of the more unsettling places in Irish mythology. Ancient stories describe it as an entrance to the other world, a place associated with Samhain, what you and me know today as Halloween, Samhain, where supernatural beings emerged into Ireland. And what stands out in early Irish belief systems is how physical everything feels. The supernatural it's not somewhere distant. It actually exists in actual places, specific caves and hills and specific landscapes. People feared these locations. They weren't abstract ideas, and the names preserved that fear. So when you know this and when you look at the map and you look at these names, you realize that you're moving through layers of memory, historical, mythological, and some impossible to separate from each other. But Accordia, well, the supernatural ones cast a kind of a fantasy over you and they kind of capture you a little bit. The darker Irish place names that really stay with me and move me are the ones that are completely real ones. The names that are connected to execution, punishment, violence, sometimes state violence. You realise that older Ireland lived incredibly close to public death. Because across Ireland, Accordia, you see places like Cnoc na Croiche, or Cnoc na Croiche, the hill of the Gallows. Cnoc, the hill, Croiche, the Gallows. And versions of it appear all over the country. Gallows Hill. And the anglicisation of it sometimes spelled Croagh, Croch, or Crogh. Different spellings but the same meaning. And at some point, people were executed there, and very publicly. We see it on the place of pubs, for example, the Gallows in the south side of Cork City. And the important thing is the visibility was deliberate. Executions were meant to be seen. The gallows were usually placed outside towns, up on the hills, along roads that people would travel regularly. The point wasn't just punishment of the subject, it was intimidation, and it was made to send a message. And in Ireland, that message was often political, because this is a country that was profoundly shaped by conquest and colonisation, especially from the time of the Tudors onwards. Control over the land, control over religion, language and identity, things that we've spoken about on this podcast before, was enforced through violence. And very often that violence happened publicly. During penal times, for example, the time of the penal laws, Catholic priests could be hunted, imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Some were hanged, some were beheaded, some were transported. And even where exact place names don't survive officially, the memory often does locally. People remembered where executions happened, where bodies were displayed, and where informers operated. And later, during rebellions, the landscape absorbed another layer of memory. 1798, the United Irishmen Rebellion, the War of Independence, the Civil War, the Young Ireland Rebellion, the Robert Emmet Times. So when you come across a place name like Gallows Hill, sometimes what you're looking at is the geography of power, a place where authority, the state, demonstrated itself physically, where the state reminded people who controlled the land. And what strikes me is how long the culture of execution survives in Ireland. This isn't ancient history disappearing into myth. Public executions continued well into the 20th century. Tom Williams, for example, executed in Crumlin Road Jail in Belfast in 1942 at just 20 years of age, hanged by the British state during the Second World War. And Williams became part of a much older historical pattern in Ireland, an executed rebel, a political hanging, and a state making an example. And in the south too, you have Charlie Kerrins, executed by the Irish government in 1944. So this complicates the story a little bit further, because now the machinery of execution isn't the colonial government of Britain anymore. It's an Irish state. And that's what makes history uncomfortable sometimes, because once a state inherits structures of control, it begins using them. So when we talk about landscapes preserving violence, it's not just medieval history or folklore or distant colonial memory. Some of this reaches almost into living memory. Place names often outlast the politics that create them. Empires disappear, governments change, borders shift and move, but the names remain. They sit on the maps and they carry the memory. There's one place that I would like to highlight that I've researched for this podcast: Béal Átha na Marbh, the approach to the ford of the dead. Béal is mouth, Átha is kind of the ford or a crossing, and na Marbh is the dead. And it's such a bleak name when you think about it. Ancient roads crossed rivers at fords. So anytime we see Átha, that's A for a TH in an Irish place name, we know that there was a crossing in this place. Now, these were dangerous places sometimes. They were places where battle sites happened, ambush points, and of course, drowning hazards. And people died there regularly enough that eventually deaths became the identity of the place itself. Now, imagine how many generations that takes for people to collectively agree that that place will be known as the Ford of the Dead, Béal Átha na Marbh. So Irish place names reveal more than anything else, not just where people lived, but what people remembered. And in a country shaped by conquest and rebellion, Geata, famine, and resistance, memory becomes political as well. And there's another kind of darkness, Accordia, that exists in Irish place names as well. Not fear and not execution, but grief and emotion, grief. Some of the saddest place names in Ireland are connected to famine and burial. And unlike the execution sites we mentioned, these places are often quiet and hidden and could be easily missed. Across Ireland, there are famine graveyards. People still call religí an Ghearta, mass graves. Famine burial grounds. Sometimes they're marked, but a lot of the time they're not. Small patches of land near roads and fields, or workhouses or old abbeys. Places where literally thousands of people pass without noticing, and literally thousands of people remain underground. And what's haunting about famine memory in Ireland is how ordinary the landscapes are. You're not talking about dramatic, castle ruins or battlefields. Sometimes it's just the corner of a field, a dip in the ground, a patch nobody builds on, because of course locally people know. And these local memories survive for generations. People say that was a famine graveyard. Bodies are buried there, don't disturb the ground. Even when official history moves on, the landscape remembers. You see it too on old funeral roads, the roads where funerals would pass. Bohra na Marbh, the roads of the dead, ancient routes used to carry bodies to burial grounds. And in Irish folklore, these roads were almost spiritual as much as they were physical. People believed the dead travelled those roads even after burial. Some roads were avoided at night. Some bends, some crossroads would become associated with spirits or bad luck. Now, it strikes me about the physical Irish memory, or how physical Irish memory is, because history in Ireland is rarely abstract. It lives in places, specific places. A field gets a name, a road gets a name, a ruined well or a patch of grass. The famine, and we've discussed it on this podcast on numerous occasions, leaves its mark on Ireland. And of course, there was more than one Geata Mór, more than one great hunger. Because there are places all over Ireland where entire communities vanished. Villages emptied, cabins collapsed, fields abandoned, and entire villages steamrollered into the ground. But the names survive longer than the people did. And those names survive on for a very good reason, because famine in Ireland wasn't experienced as a natural disaster alone. It was tied to eviction, land clearance, colonial economics, political failure is what some people would say, or attempted genocide is what other people would say. So the landscape carries not just grief, but resentment too. Famine memory in Ireland feels different from a lot of other historical tragedies. It's not remembered purely as something that happened, but it's something that was allowed to happen. And because of that, the burial places are more than graveyards, they become evidence, a physical reminder in the landscape. And going back to the idea of grief, Accordia, sometimes the reminder in the landscape is directly tied to that, to grief, and specifically separation. One of the most haunting examples of this is called Geata nDeor. Geata nDeor, the gate of tears. Geata is the gate, nDeor is the tears. And what this is about is how human it feels. That's what I feel on this. It's not mythological this time. It is dramatic to an extent, but it's heartbreak made geographical. And one example of this survives in the Carlow-Wicklow border area. Before modern roads and modern bridges, people crossed the River Derry, and at the end of the lane coming over Drumderry Hill, according to local memory, this becomes the place where emigrants leaving the parish said their goodbyes, their families, and had their last look back, the final stopping point, the last view back home before they went on to a different world and a different life. So when you look at it properly, it's devastating. People standing at this crossing, looking back over the valley towards the Wicklow Hills, towards home, knowing that they probably would never see any of it again. Famine era emigration in Ireland wasn't imagined romantically at the time. It wasn't starting a new adventure or beginning a new life in the modern context of it. For many people, it felt much closer to an exile, a one-way departure. And parents watched their children leave, brothers and sisters separating permanently, people leaving because there was simply no future where they were in the midst of An Gorta Moor. And you realise something else about that name, the Gate of Tears. It comes from ordinary people, how ordinary people experience this particular place. The community named the place emotionally. Irish place names are so powerful sometimes. They preserve feeling as much as history. And you see the same thing in Donegal, in Donegal, or Tirconnell as it's called also. Because up there in that county you have Droichead nDeor. So a minute ago we had Geata nDeor, and now we have Droichead nDeor. Droichead is the bridge, so the bridge of tears. This is another place associated with emigration during and after An Gorta Moor, the famine. Families would walk immigrants part of the journey towards the coast, but this bridge became the place they separated, the last goodbye. And there's something really powerful about memorializing that moment instead of the destination. It's not about New York or Boston or the ships. The goodbye itself is the place name, the emotional wound that kind of becomes attached to the landscape. So this is ordinary places carrying extraordinary grief and emotions. And across Ireland, there are landscapes like this: famine graveyards, coffin roads, burial fields, abandoned villages. A bridge where people cried, a road where somebody left forever, and a field where people were buried. And eventually, the land, through the community, keeps the memory for them. Now, earlier in the podcast, the Cordial mentioned how Christianity brought the devil into the landscape of Ireland. And that prior to that, there were some otherworldly names. We mentioned, for example, Paul na Béist, and we mentioned Uibh na Cuit, or Uibh na Gat. But here's another one which predates Christianity, and it's around the black pig. This might be one of the strangest recurring images in Irish folklore, all across parts of Ulster, especially in counties like Muinachán, Monaghan, Cavan, Cavan, Leitrim, and Fermanagh. There are enormous ancient earthworks cutting through the landscape, long ditches, banks, defensive lines, and they're known collectively as Clí na Mucha Duva, the Black Pig's Dyke. And even today, parts of this still feel eerie and strange. They're huge scars running across hills and fields. They're older than Christianity, older than English occupation in Ireland, and possibly over 2,000 years old. Archaeologists think that these were probably defensive earthworks, maybe borders between ancient kingdoms. They may have been barriers against the old practice of cattle raiding, but folklore gives us a different explanation completely. Because according to legend, a gigantic black pig tore through the Irish landscape with its tusks, ripping open the earth as it moved. And in some versions of the story, the pig isn't even really a pig. It's a cursed human, kind of a sorcerer or a shape shifter. Sometimes a schoolmaster transformed through dark magic. And what's fascinating about this is how widespread that story became. Different counties have different versions, different names. Sometimes it's called the Black Pig's Dyke. Sometimes it's called the Worm's Ditch. Sometimes it's called the Race of the Black Pig. But the same feeling survives underneath all of them. There's something unnatural here, and it moved through the landscape. And it's something dangerous. And the black pig itself carries meaning in Irish folklore. It was often associated with disaster, war, violence, plague, chaos. It's like an omen moving through the Irish landscape. And this is an example of older folklore connected to the Dyke predicting catastrophe, stories warning that violence would someday return to the Valley of the Black Pig. And when you think about Irish history, especially in Ulster, you can see why these stories endured and stayed on. Because the earthworks themselves become part of the psychology of the landscape. Ancient boundaries surviving into modern political strife. Old divisions lingering physically in the earth itself. And that's why the black pig is so interesting and compelling. It sits in this strange space between archaeology, folklore, history, and fear. Nobody fully agrees what it originally meant. People clearly felt something about it, and they felt something about it for centuries. Enough to keep telling the stories, the folklore. Enough to name the land after it. And this is something that constantly happens in Ireland. Mythology, politics, and people shaping the landscape that carries older memory and memories underneath foot. Now, Corja, my friends, as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, when you start looking at the place names in our land here in Ireland, you start looking at their meaning. You hear them differently and you hear almost echoes of history. In this podcast alone, we've looked at a mountain in Tipperary associated with the devil, a bridge in Donegal where families said their goodbyes forever, execution hills sitting outside ordinary towns, ancient earthworks in Ulster linked to folklore, and a monstrous black pig tearing through the land, a cave in Roscommon that people once believed opened up into the other world. None of these places were invented as tourist attractions. That's what makes them more powerful and more interesting. These names emerged naturally, or perhaps supernaturally, from fear, from grief, from memory. Communities trying to describe what a place meant to them emotionally. Sometimes the names preserve mythology, sometimes they preserve historical trauma, and sometimes the two become impossible to separate. In Ireland especially, history and folklore constantly bleed into each other. You can see it in something like Bearnán, Éile. Originally just the little gap of Éile, a couple of ordinary geographical names. But centuries later, folklore transforms it into the devil's bit. The landscape gets rewritten through religion and storytelling. Places like Cnoc na Grithe, Hill of the Gallows, where the name itself preserves the memory of public execution. A reminder that in Ireland the landscape was often used politically too, power displayed physically, colonial authority visible. And Geata nDeor, the gate of the tears. It's not supernatural, it's not violent, but it is emotional. It's grief. It's a bridge, a road, and a final goodbye. The landscape remembering heartbreak. Older again, the Black Pig's Dyke. Ancient earthworks carrying stories of something monstrous, a force ripping through the land, a myth surviving beside archaeology. Nobody fully sure where history ends and folklore begins. There's an uncertainty in that, but it's part of what makes Irish place names so compelling. They feel alive, they're layered, and every generation has played a role in shaping that collective memory. These place names tell us what happened, they tell us what people feared and what people lost. So sometimes Accordia, Ireland can feel haunted as a country, not necessarily by ghosts, but haunted by memory. The past never fully buried, staying alive in fields, roads, hills, rivers, and most of all, in place names. Accordia, I really enjoyed putting together that episode. If you enjoyed this episode of Undercover Irish, you may well enjoy an episode I did previously called The Body of Ireland, where I looked at how place names in Ireland mirror the human body and how we understand the landscape. If you enjoyed this episode of Accordia, please do like or subscribe wherever you are. Leave a review. It makes an absolutely massive difference to helping the podcast along the way. And Accordia, if you want, please do support the podcast on Patreon. Go to Patreon, and for the price of a cup of coffee, you can help with the overheads of this particular podcast. As I said, Accordia, I really enjoyed putting this one together. We're back with the place names, something familiar to this podcast. So, Accordia, thank you so much for being with me on this episode. Gurv míle maith agat velum. Until the next one, Accordia. Bergi bua agus slán go fóill.